The Artificer of the Deep. The dungeon breathed. John Doe had learned to feel it long ago, in the first months after he had stopped counting days and started measuring time in magicule tides instead. The ambient particles ebbed and flowed through the stone corridors like blood through ancient veins, a slow inhalation that pressed against his skin for hours, then a longer exhalation that left the air thin and strangely hungry. 3 years underground had taught him to read these rhythms without thought, the same way he had once read the pressure gauges on a test bench, not as data to be analyzed, but as a language spoken so fluently that translation became unnecessary. His workshop occupied a natural cavern, approximately 20 meters wide and 50 meters long, with a ceiling that varied from 3 meters at the northern pinch point to 10 meters near the underground spring that fed his water supply. He had chosen this space carefully during his second year, after the shallow tunnels had grown too familiar and the deeper chambers had tried to kill him twice. The location was deep enough that the ambient magicule concentration remained consistently high, useful for his experiments, necessary for his crystal growth, but not so deep that the dungeon's more aggressive residents wandered through on a daily basis. A few simple traps reinforced the entrances. Tripwires connected to clusters of hollow chitin that clattered when disturbed, strategically placed stones that shifted under weight, bells strung on monofilament sinew. Nothing magical. Sometimes the simplest solutions were best. The cavern itself held the accumulated evidence of a mind that refused to be idle. 2 wooden tables dominated the center, their surfaces scarred by knife marks and stained with the residues of a dozen different growth mediums. A bed frame constructed from monster bones and stretched leather sat against the far wall, piled with fur pelts that John had tanned himself using a crude alchemical process involving crushed wisp caps and prolonged soaking in dungeon water. The bed was functional rather than comfortable, but he had slept in worse places during his engineering days: field tests in Siberian winter, prototype evaluations in desert heat. A bed was a bed. He had never understood people who romanticized them. Light came from multiple sources: torches, burning, rendered monster fat in iron sconces he had traded for 3 separate shipments of crystals, clusters of naturally glowing stones that he had chipped from a vein 2 levels up, and patches of luminescent moss that had spread naturally across the northern wall, thriving in the damp air. The combined effect was dim by surface standards, but perfectly adequate for eyes that had learned to read darkness better than faces. John had not seen his own reflection in a mirror for over a year. He did not miss it. He sat at the nearer table now, his spine curved in the particular shape of exhaustion that came from sustained concentration rather than physical labor. The unconscious wave played across his skin in rhythms so familiar that he no longer noticed it, a near-invisible pulse that started at his sternum and radiated outward in concentric rings, like a stone dropped into still water. The purge weave loosened the bonds of accumulated magicule residue as it formed, bleeding the invisible viscosity off his flesh and organs and magical channels before it could build to dangerous levels. Most delvers needed clean air and surface rest to clear even a fraction of this buildup. John had not seen the surface in 3 years. His body had adapted. The wave was part of him now, as automatic as his heartbeat, as unconscious as the way his pupils dilated in low light. On the table before him rested a crystal no larger than his thumb. It was an ugly thing, cloudy where it should have been transparent, fractured along 2 internal planes that had nothing to do with the lattice structure he had intended, and shot through with uneven hollows that ranged from hair fine to almost a millimeter in diameter. The growth process had lasted 3 days, 72 hours of sustained weaving without sleep, without more than brief pauses to chew dried meat and swallow water, without allowing his concentration to waver for more than a few seconds at a time. He had held the pattern in the magicules around him, a simple fork splitting into 30 parallel lines, and he had let the crystal grow around that maintained field, carving voids into its structure as it formed. The result was crude, inefficient, probably useless for anything beyond the most basic demonstration. But the hollows were there. John turned the crystal over in his fingers, feeling the slight roughness of its uncut surface. His hands were steady. They were always steady, even after 3 days without rest, even with his internal residue climbing toward the threshold where he would need to perform an active deep purge before he could safely sleep. Steady hands were a matter of training, and he had trained himself to exhaustion many times before. The tremor that wanted to live in his muscles had been locked away years ago, in a different life, just on a different world. The silence pressed against his ears, broken only by the distant drip of water from the spring and the occasional scuttle of some small dungeon creature in the shadows beyond his torchlight. He had grown comfortable with this silence long ago. Loneliness was a hunger for connection, and John's hungers were directed elsewhere, at the geometry of magicules, at the slow unraveling of a dungeon's secrets, at the precise angle of a spiral pattern and what it did to heat differentials. The city above had people who would call him friend if he let them. He had not let them. He did not intend to start. He set the crystal down on the table and reached for his notebook. The leather-bound volume lay open beside a cluster of crystal fragments too small for any practical use, its pages filled with the cramped, precise handwriting of a man who had learned to document everything because memory was fallible and the cost of forgetting was measured in wasted days. He pulled the notebook closer, dipped a carved bone stylus into a small pot of ink made from crushed charcoal and monster blood, and began to write. But first, the purge. He could feel the residue pressing against the inside of his skin now. Not painful, exactly, but present in the way that humidity was present before a thunderstorm. The unconscious wave had kept the worst of it at bay, but 3 days of sustained weaving had pushed his internal clearance to its limit. If he waited much longer, the residue would begin to crystallize in his magical channels, and that was a problem that required days of recovery rather than minutes of active work. John closed his eyes and reached inward. The active, deep purge was nothing like the passive wave that played across his skin. That was automatic, unconscious, as simple as breathing. This was surgery. He gathered his awareness and pushed it down through his sternum, into the network of channels that carried magicules through his body, a system that most mages never learned to feel, let alone manipulate. The net weave came first, spreading through his channels like a fisherman's net cast into dark water, its interlocking lines forming a sieve that would catch the accumulated residue. Then the wave, layered carefully over the net, its rhythmic pulse designed to loosen bonds and set trapped particles in motion. He began to write while he worked. Growth attempt 22, his stylus scratched across the page. Pattern, fork into 30 parallel lines. Input single, outputs 30. Target function, kinetic acceleration, distributed. The purge weave pulsed through his chest, and he felt the first residue release, a slick, oily sensation that traveled up his throat and out through his pores. He exhaled slowly, and the air fogged with invisible waste. Duration 72 hours, plus approximately 4 hours of setup and teardown. No significant interruptions to the weave. A lie, or at least an omission. There had been interruptions. Not to the weave itself, that had held, but to his body's ability to maintain it. His hands had cramped on the second night, the muscles locked into rigid claws around the shape of the pattern. He had worked through the cramping, had redirected his attention to the ache and then beyond it, because stopping was not an option. The crystal did not care about his pain. It would grow whether he suffered or not, but if he let the pattern waver, it would grow wrong. He wrote the truth a line later, minor physiological degradation observed. Hand cramps at hour 38, resolved by shifting weave maintenance to subcortical focus for approximately 15 minutes while manually stretching. No pattern distortion detected. The net and wave combination swept through his lower organs now, liver, kidneys, the coiled mass of his intestines. Residue accumulated there, more slowly than in the channels, but it also released more reluctantly. He pushed the purge harder, felt the characteristic burn of a weave operating at the edge of his tolerance. Growth medium, batch 7. Crushed emberhound bone, 20%. Powdered ether crystal, 30%. Wisp cap slurry, 50%. Medium temperature maintained at approximately 40 degrees Celsius via ambient magicule concentration plus passive heating from the weave itself. The monster had come on the second day. John remembered the sound exactly, a scraping of chitin against stone, followed by the heavy tread of something that weighed as much as a man and moved with the particular care of a predator who had learned that loud noises meant empty bellies. He had been deep in the weave at that point, his attention split between the crystal's slow growth and the constant fine adjustment of the pattern's fidelity. The scrape had come from the eastern tunnel, the one he had blocked with a bell and string trap after a rockback had wandered through 6 months ago and knocked over his entire supply of dried meat. External interference. At hour 41, a tunnel scavenger, species uncertain, likely a chitin crawler based on sound, triggered the eastern perimeter alarm. The creature did not enter the workshop. It lingered at the tunnel mouth for approximately 8 minutes, then departed. No weave disruption. He had not moved, had barely allowed himself to breathe differently. The pattern had required his attention, and the traps had required his trust, and he had given each what it needed. The crawler had scraped and sniffed and eventually lost interest. John had not allowed himself to feel relief. Relief was an emotion, and emotions were distractions, and distractions broke crystals. The purge reached his bones. This was the worst part. The residue that clung to the marrow did not want to release. It had soaked into the calcium lattice over months of continuous dungeon exposure, and forcing it out required a precision that bordered on the masochistic. John's jaw tightened. Sweat beaded on his forehead and ran down the bridge of his nose. The net and wave combination pressed deeper, and he felt the residue begin to flow, slowly, reluctantly, like honey from a cold jar. He wrote through the discomfort. Pattern fidelity during growth, suboptimal. Visual inspection of the weave at hour 12 showed approximately 80% consistency across all 30 lines. By hour 48, consistency had dropped to approximately 65%, with the outermost most lines showing the most degradation. Probable cause, asymmetric fatigue in the maintaining hand, leading to slight distortion of the fork's branch angles. The stylus scratched. He blinked sweat from his eyes. Potential solutions: reduce line count to 10 or 15 for next attempt. Higher line density requires more precise hand positioning and may exceed current physiological limits for 3-day duration. Alternatively, develop a physical jig to hold the fork geometry, reducing manual maintenance requirements. Second alternative is preferable, but requires materials not currently available. Alternative possible conclusion: the 3-day limit is not a hard ceiling, but a training barrier. With practice, duration may extend. With extension, line count may increase. This is a matter of conditioning, not physics. He finished the purge. The last of the residue evacuated through his pores and his breath and the subtle channels that connected his body to the ambient magicules around him. He felt light, hollow, clean in a way that surface-born delvers never experienced, because their natural clearance could never reach the places his active weave had just scoured. John opened his eyes. The notebook waited. He had written 4 pages without looking at them, his hand moving by memory and proprioception while his attention remained fixed on the internal purge. The handwriting was messier than usual, but legible. He turned past the notes on the growth process, past the observations about medium temperature and pattern degradation and the chitin crawler that had almost ruined everything, and reached the final section. Results. He set the stylus down and picked up the crystal again. It was still ugly. The cloudiness had not magically cleared during the purge. The fractures still ran through its interior like cracks in drying mud. But he held it up to the nearest glowing stone, a fist-sized cluster of naturally luminescent crystal that he had mounted on a wooden stand, and looked not at the flaws but at the hollows. They were there. 30 channels, more or less. Some were almost straight. Some curved slightly, following the path of his wavering attention during the worst hours of the second night. Some were wide enough to admit a hair. Some were so narrow that he could barely see them, even with a light angled just so. But they were there. Hollow spaces carved by the persistent presence of his maintained magicule field, empty channels that would guide future magicules exactly as solid lines would. If he pumped enough power through them, if he accepted the inefficiency, if he ignored the fact that this crystal was a crude stone axe when he had dreamed of a scalpel. He turned it over, examined the input face, where the fork's single entry point had carved a shallow depression. Examined the output face, where 30 tiny apertures stared back at him like the eyes of a very small insect. The crystal was imperfect, fractured, cloudy, probably good for no more than 1,000 uses before the internal stresses caused it to fail, compared to a natural crystal's 30,000. But the hollows were there. John set it down carefully, aligned with the edge of the table, so it would not roll. Then he stood, stretched the ache from his spine, and walked to the other table where his testing apparatus waited. A simple block of stone with a groove cut into its surface, designed to hold a crystal in place while he injected magicules from a controlled source. A small stone sat at the far end of the groove, ready to receive kinetic force. He placed the crystal in the groove, connected the magicule source, a drained ether crystal that he had refilled from the ambient concentration, crude but consistent, adjusted the alignment so the output face pointed directly at the stone. Then he stopped. For a moment, just a moment, he allowed himself to feel something other than exhaustion and clinical observation. The crystal was ugly. The process had nearly broken him. 3 days of his life, compressed into a thumb-sized lump of flawed lattice and empty channels. If this did not work, if the hollows were too misaligned, too narrow, too fractured to guide magicules at all, then he would have learned something, but he would not have made something. And making was the point. Making was the only point. He injected the magicules. A trickle at first, barely enough to reach the input face. Then more. The crystal drank the power hungrily, too hungrily, because its internal fractures bled energy in ways that a perfect lattice would not, but the hollows caught what remained and guided it forward. 30 streams of magicules, uneven and sputtering, emerged from the 30 output apertures. The stone at the far end of the groove did not explode, did not shoot across the cavern. It rolled. 6 centimeters, maybe less. John stared at it. The stone sat there 6 centimeters from where it had started, having demonstrated that kinetic force had been applied and that the crystal had functioned as intended. 6 centimeters was not impressive. 6 centimeters was not going to revolutionize anything. 6 centimeters was the kind of result that would make a surface mage laugh and throw the crystal in the trash. But the stone had moved. John reached out and picked up the crystal. It was warm now, the magicule flow having heated its fractured lattice. The cloudiness had not changed. The hollows had not straightened. It was still ugly, still inefficient, still a crude approximation of what he had imagined when he first conceived of growing his own crystals. It was also proof. He held it up to the glowing stone again, watching the light catch the edges of the fractures, and allowed himself a small, quiet smile that no one was there to see. Then he set the crystal down, picked up his stylus, and began to write the next entry. Result: positive. Kinetic transfer achieved. Estimated efficiency, approximately 5% of theoretical maximum. Next attempt, reduce line count to 15. Increase growth medium temperature by 5 degrees. Explore alternative seed crystal orientations. The dungeon breathed around him, slow and deep, and John Doe, 17 years old, 3 years lost, presumed dead, smiled in the darkness and kept writing. The days blurred after that, melting into weeks, the weeks stacking into a small mountain of failed crystals and half-empty notebooks. John stopped counting attempts somewhere after 25 and started measuring progress in efficiency percentages instead, because percentages did not care about his fatigue or his hunger or the way his back ached from leaning over the growth basin for 72 hours at a stretch. Percentages were honest. Percentages told him whether he was moving forward or merely spinning in place. He tried different crystal shapes first because the geometry of the lattice seemed like the most obvious variable. A short, fat crystal, roughly spherical, grown from a seed that had been tumbled smooth in an underground stream, produced hollows that curved in on themselves, the magicules swirling into eddies instead of exiting with any coherent direction. The stone on his test apparatus did not roll. It vibrated slightly, then fell over. John noted the result, set the crystal aside for possible future use as a vibration source, and moved on. A hexagonal cross-section, grown from a seed that he had deliberately fractured into a 6-sided prism, produced hollows that aligned beautifully along the long axis but showed unacceptable variation in diameter from one channel to the next. The widest channel carried nearly half the magicule flow, leaving the other 5 to sputter and choke. Efficiency: 3%. Worse than the original. Circular cross-section, grown from a seed that he had carved into a rough cylinder with a knife, produced the most consistent results so far. The hollows clustered near the center of the crystal, where the magicule field had been strongest, and their diameters varied by only about 20%. Efficiency: 6%. An improvement, but not the leap he wanted. The pattern that emerged over those weeks was simple. Longer crystals produced better kinetic transfer. A crystal of 5 centimeters pushed a stone across the table. A crystal of 8 centimeters pushed the stone off the table. A crystal of 12 centimeters sent the stone bouncing across the cavern floor. The theoretical limit, as far as John could determine from first principles, was that the magicules needed time and distance to transfer their momentum to the projectile. A longer crystal meant a longer acceleration path, which meant a faster projectile, which meant more kinetic energy at the muzzle. But the 3-day limit held firm. He could not sustain the weave for longer than 72 hours without risking a catastrophic failure of either the crystal or his own body. 72 hours, given his current growth rate, produced a crystal of approximately 14 centimeters. Longer would have to wait until he found a way to accelerate the growth process or extend his sustainable weave duration. He turned to the growth medium next. Batch 7 had used crushed emberhound bone, powdered ether crystal, and wisp cap slurry in a 50-20-30 ratio. Batch 8 replaced the wisp cap slurry with veil moss infused water, and the resulting crystal was so cloudy that he could not even see the hollows. Batch 9 used pure powdered aether crystal with a drop of his own blood as a catalyst, an idea borrowed from certain alchemical texts he had skimmed during his rare trips to the surface. The crystal that emerged was clear as glass, beautiful in a way that made him pause, but the hollows were almost non-existent. The blood had done something to the lattice, had made it resistant to void formation. Efficiency: less than 1%. Batch 12 was the one that mattered. He had been experimenting with proportions, trying to find the sweet spot between bone and aether and moss when he ran out of wisp caps entirely. The nearest cluster was 2 levels up and required a hunt through tunnels he had not visited in months. He did not want to waste the time. Instead, he substituted a slurry of crushed chitin crawler carapace, reasoning that the chitin might provide a different crystalline nucleation matrix. The crystal that grew over the next 3 days was ugly in a new way. Not cloudy, but streaked, like marble, with veins of darker material running through the otherwise translucent lattice. The hollows were uneven but present. He tested it. Efficiency: 8%. 8%, a full 3 points above his previous best. John sat back in his chair and stared at the number. The improvement came from the chitin, had to be the chitin because nothing else had changed. The chitin was providing a nucleation surface that encouraged more regular crystal growth, reducing the internal fractures that bled off magicule energy. He made a note in his journal, then made another note to harvest every chitin crawler he could find in the coming weeks. The pattern refinement came next, and it was here that John made his first real mistake. He had been trying to force the 30-line fork to work, because more lines meant more magicule channels, and more channels meant more kinetic force applied to the projectile. That was simple physics. But the 30-line fork required precision that his fatigued hands could not maintain over 3 days, and the outermost lines always drifted, always curved, always produced hollows that pointed slightly away from the target instead of directly at it. He reduced the line count to 15, then to 10. The 10-line fork was a revelation. With fewer branches to maintain, he could focus more attention on each individual line, could hold them straighter, correct drift before it became permanent. The crystal that emerged from his next growth attempt was still cloudy and still fractured, but the hollows were almost perfectly parallel. He tested it. Efficiency, 12%. The stone rolled off the table and hit the cavern floor with a sharp crack. John picked it up, set it back on the table, and tested again. 12%. Consistent. The crystal was using only 10 channels instead of 30, which meant the total kinetic force was lower than what a perfect 30-line crystal would produce, but the efficiency was higher. A trade-off. He documented it carefully, then spent a few seconds to calculate whether 10 channels at 12% efficiency delivered more or less total force than 30 channels at 5% efficiency. The math was straightforward. 10 channels at 12% was equivalent to 1.2 channels of theoretical perfect output. 30 channels at 5% was equivalent to 1.5 channels. The 30-line crystal, even with its terrible efficiency, still delivered more total force. But the 30-line crystal also had a higher failure rate. The 10-line crystal took the same 3 days but had never failed. Not once. The consistency was worth more than the theoretical maximum. He wrote this conclusion in bold letters at the top of a fresh page. For now, 10 lines. Scale later. Weeks passed. The pile of discarded crystals grew beside his workbench, a small mountain of cloudy failures and partial successes. He tried a 12-line fork. The efficiency dropped to 9%. He tried an 8-line fork. The efficiency rose to 14%, but the total force was noticeably lower. He settled on 10 as the optimal balance and began refining everything else. The breakthrough came on a day that John did not mark as special. He had been experimenting with seed crystal orientation, trying different angles of the initial lattice relative to the direction of magicule flow. The theory, as he had worked it out in his notebooks, was that the seed's natural crystalline axes would influence the hollows as they formed, that the voids would prefer to grow along certain directions, just as cracks in drying mud prefer to follow the path of least resistance. If he aligned the magicule field with the seed's easiest growth direction, the hollows would form straighter, cleaner, with fewer deviations. The crystal that emerged from that growth attempt was different. It was still cloudy, still fractured in places. But when he held it up to the light, the hollows were not just parallel, they were straight. Perfectly straight, as far as his eye could tell, running from the input face to the output face without any of the slight curves that had plagued his previous attempts. The 10 lines were evenly spaced, each one the same diameter, each one aligned exactly with the crystal's long axis. John did not test it immediately. He sat with it for a while, turning it over in his hands, trying to find the flaw. There was always a flaw, but the longer he looked, the more he began to believe that this one might be different. He placed it in the testing apparatus, connected the magicule source, placed a stone at the far end of the groove. He injected the magicules. The stone did not roll. It shot across the cavern, a blur of gray against the dim torchlight, and struck the far wall with a sound like a hammer hitting rock. John heard the crack of impact, followed by the patter of fragments falling to the floor. He stood slowly, walked to the wall, and crouched to examine the damage. The stone had shattered on impact. That was expected. What he had not expected was the crater beneath it, finger deep, palm wide, a divot carved into solid dungeon stone by nothing more than kinetic force and velocity. He traced the crater's edge with his fingertip, feeling the rough texture where the stone had pulverized the rock. Then he stood, turned, and walked back to the table. He picked up the crystal, held it to the light again, looked at the 10 straight hollows, the even spacing, the clean input and output faces. 18% efficiency. He had not calculated it yet, would need to run the numbers, compare the stone's mass and the distance traveled and the energy required to crater solid stone, but he knew. He could feel it in the same way he had once felt whether a combustion engine was running at optimal compression. This crystal was different. This crystal was right. John Doe grinned. It was not the small, quiet smile of a man who had just confirmed a hypothesis. It was the wide, unguarded grin of someone who had built something that should not have been possible and had watched it work. He laughed, a short, sharp sound that echoed off the cavern walls and startled a cluster of luminescent moss into a brief, sympathetic glow. He paced the length of his workshop, the crystal still clutched in his hand. 3 steps to the bed, 3 steps back to the table. He was muttering, words spilling out in a low stream that he barely registered. 18%, that's 3 times the original. If I can just get the line count up, if I can just find a way to extend the growth duration, if I can... Stop and monk. He stopped in front of his notebook, flipped to a blank page, and began sketching. Not a crystal this time. A weapon. The lines took shape under his stylus. A long tube, a chamber for the crystal, a mechanism to hold the projectile in place until the magicules flowed. He had worked on enough diagrams of firearms back on Earth, had worked on enough arms projects to understand the principles of a ballistic weapon. A barrel to direct the projectile, a breech to load it. But this would not use gunpowder, would not use chemical explosives at all. The crystal would do the work, converting magicules directly into kinetic force, accelerating the projectile down the barrel faster than any chemical reaction could manage. He sketched faster. The crystal would need to be longer. 14 centimeters was good, but longer would be better. He would need to find a way to extend the growth duration or accelerate the growth rate. He would need a barrel material that could withstand the stress, a projectile material that would not shatter on launch, a housing that would protect the crystal from the shock of firing. His hand moved across the page, filling the margins with calculations. Muzzle velocity, kinetic energy, recoil. He had not felt this kind of focused excitement since the first successful test of a prototype engine that he had designed from scratch. The grin did not fade. It settled into something more permanent, a curve at the corner of his mouth that remained even as he worked through the practical problems, even as he noted the limitations of his current setup, even as he reminded himself that this was only the first step and that the real work had not yet begun. He was still grinning when he reached for his journal to document the 18% crystal, and he was still grinning when he began listing the materials he would need to build the weapon that the crystal had just made possible. The list took shape over several hours, filling 3 pages with cramped handwriting and small schematic drawings. Barrel material, something dense, resistant to magicule degradation, capable of withstanding the sudden acceleration of a projectile from 0 to lethal velocity. Projectile material, metal if he could find it, stone if he could not, wood only as a last resort. Housing for the crystal, leather and wood, with some method of securing the crystal so firmly that it could not move under the stress of firing. The crystal would want to fly backward when the magicules pushed the projectile forward. Every action had an equal and opposite reaction. And if he did not anchor the crystal properly, the first shot would send it through the back of his hand and into the wall behind him. He knew where to find metal. 2 kilometers from his workshop, following a tunnel that branched off from the main artery and descended sharply. A lava lake spread across a natural chamber so vast that the far side vanished into darkness. The heat was intense enough to make the air shimmer, and the ambient magicule concentration here was almost painful, dense enough that his unconscious wave had to work harder, pulsing faster to keep the residue from building too quickly. John had discovered the chamber during his first year, had mapped its perimeter carefully, and had noted the veins of raw metal that ran through the walls near the lake's edge. The heat and pressure of the lava had deposited them there over countless years, and no one else had ever come to claim them. The tunnel was too deep, too hot, too dangerous for normal delvers. He gathered his tools, a leather bag for carrying ore, a stone hammer, and a small ether crystal to provide light. The journey took 40 minutes at a steady walk, his footsteps echoing off the stone, his eyes adjusting to the increasing glow that bled through from the chamber ahead. The heat hit him first, a wall of it that dried his throat and made his skin prickle. Then the light, orange and red, pulsing gently as the lava lake breathed with the same tidal rhythm as the dungeon itself. John approached the nearest metal deposit, a vein of dull gray ore that ran through the basalt like a scar, its surface rough and pitted. He had analyzed samples before, had determined that the metal was similar to iron, but with trace amounts of something else, something that made it harder and more resistant to heat. Good enough for bullets, good enough for a barrel, though he had already decided that wood would be easier to work and less likely to crack under stress. He did not have a pickaxe. He did not need one. John raised his right hand, extended his index finger, and began to weave. The pattern was simple, a line for kinetic force, wrapped in a spiral to generate heat, with a lens at the tip to focus the result into a narrow, intense stream. He had developed this particular weave over the past year, had refined it through dozens of tests on scrap stone and discarded bone, and had learned to shape it so that the magicules emerged from his fingertip as a blade of superheated plasma. The air in front of his fingers shimmered, then glowed, then turned white as the temperature climbed past anything that natural fire could achieve. He injected a handful of sand into the weave, common silica, carried in a small pouch at his belt, and the plasma brightened further as the sand melted and vaporized, adding abrasive particles to the cutting stream. The result was not elegant. It was not efficient, but it could cut through solid rock like a hot knife through butter, and that was all he needed. The plasma torch hissed as he brought it to the metal deposit. The ore glowed, then melted, then ran down the wall in small, bright rivulets. He worked carefully, carving out chunks of metal-bearing rock, letting them fall into the leather bag at his feet. The heat from the torch was intense enough that he had to turn his face away every few seconds, had to blink tears from his eyes rise, had to remind himself to keep the unconscious wave running to vent the magicule residue that accumulated with every second of sustained weaving. He mined for an hour. The bag grew heavy, then heavier. Then John started the refining process. He placed the ore in a crucible and places it on top of the lave lake's crust, on a place that would not immediately collapse, swallowing his hard work. He stepped back, wiped sweat from his forehead, and waited. The heat and gravity converted the raw ore deposits to a usable metal liquid and slag. John had prepared for this. Months ago, during a trading trip to the surface, he had purchased a small quantity of metal casting sand, fine, heat-resistant, capable of holding intricate shapes when packed properly. He had also acquired a crucible, a thick-walled clay vessel that could withstand the temperatures required to melt raw ore. Both items had cost him barely anything, just a few medium-quality ether crystals. The ore melted slowly, impurities rising to the surface as slag. John skimmed them off with a stone-tipped rod, working with the patience of a man who had spent 3 years learning that rushing only produced failures. When the molten metal glowed a clean, even orange, John created a new weave with hundreds of straight lines pointing from a sphere inwards. Then he moved the weaved spell over the crucible and increased the magicule output. With silent confidence, the crucible rose to the middle of the spell, where the lines meet. Then John slowly moved the weaved spell to the molds and tilted it. The crucible, captured by the force, obeyed and released the molten metal. Not all of it, as the spell that held the crucible also held some of the glowing liquid metal, but it was more than enough. The molds waited on a bed of dry sand. 5 small bullet shapes, each about 9 millimeters in diameter and roughly cylindrical, and a longer, thinner shape for the barrel. He had carved the patterns himself, had packed the casting sand around them carefully, had baked the molds dry over a slow fire to remove any moisture that might cause steam explosions. The molten metal flowed into the cavities, hissing and smoking as it displaced the air. John watched it fill, then set the crucible down and waited for the metal to cool. The bullets came out first. He cracked open their molds, picked each one up with a similar but smaller spell, and examined them under the light of a glowing stone. They were rough. Casting sand could only do so much, but they were solid, without visible cracks or voids. He would need to refine their shape, would need to smooth the surfaces and ensure that each bullet was as uniform as possible. But the raw material was there. 5 bullets, enough for initial testing. The barrel was more difficult. The casting had produced a hollow tube approximately 30 centimeters long and 8 millimeters in internal diameter, with walls that varied in thickness from 4 millimeters at the thickest point to barely 2 millimeter at the thinnest. It was not perfect. It was not even close to perfect. But it was a tube, and a tube was what he needed. Back at the workshop, John spent 2 days refining the components. He used the plasma torch again, but at a much lower intensity, a whisper of heat compared to the roar he had used for mining. The fine control required concentration, required him to hold the patterns steady while moving his hand in precise arcs, required him to stop every few minutes to let his finger cool and his magicule channels recover. He smoothed the bullets first, rotating each one slowly as the plasma kissed its surface, melting away rough spots and filling small voids. The process left them slightly smaller than the original casting, but more uniform. He measured each one with a pair of calipers he had carved from monster bone, noting the variations, selecting the 3 most consistent for the first tests. The barrel required more care. He used the plasma torch to even out the wall thickness to smooth the interior bore. The work was tedious, the progress measured in millimeters per hour, but he did not rush. Rushing produced mistakes. Mistakes produced wasted metal, and he had only this one barrel. While the metal cooled between passes, he turned his attention to the wooden barrel. The dense wood from the underground river had been drying in a corner of his workshop for months, cut into planks and stacked with small spacers to allow air circulation. He selected the straightest grain, measured it against the metal tube, and began carving. The wooden barrel would wrap around the metal one, not as a liner, but as a structural support, a way to distribute the stresses of firing. The metal tube alone would be too thin, too likely to crack under repeated use. The wood would give it strength. He carved slowly, testing the fit every few minutes, adjusting the channel until the metal tube sat flush against the wood along its entire length. Then he wove the anchor pattern. The weave was crude. He was still learning how to combine net and anchor for structural reinforcement, but it held. He layered the pattern over the wooden barrel, letting the magicules sink into the grain, binding the wood fibers together and fusing them to the metal beneath. The faint glow of the anchor lines traced the barrel's length, pulsing slightly as the weave settled into place. When he was finished, the barrel was no longer wood and metal, but a composite, the two materials working together as one. The crystal housing came last. He carved a block of the same dense wood into a rough cylinder, then hollowed out a channel that would hold the 14-centimeter crystal snugly. One side of the housing would attach to the barrel in parallel, while one end would provide access for magicule injection. The connection between the housing and the barrel needed to be absolute. If the crystal moved even a millimeter when the gun fired, the kinetic transfer would be disrupted, and the crystal might shatter, or worse, become a projectile itself. He solved the problem with leather and more anchor weaves. A sleeve of wet rawhide wrapped around the junction while still soft, then dried slowly over 3 days until it shrank to a grip that could not be pulled apart without cutting. Additional anchor lines layered over the leather and into the wood beneath, binding everything together at the magical level. When he was finished, the crystal housing and the barrel were effectively a single piece. They would not separate. The final assembly took an evening. He slid the crystal from the muzzle side into its housing, input end facing the rear. The fit was tight. He had carved the channel with a tolerance of less than a millimeter, and the crystal seated itself with a soft click that felt final. He added a grip from wood and leather to create the familiar shape of a gun, to ease in aiming and absorb the recoil. He added a simple sighting notch at the muzzle, carved into the wood, aligned as best he could with the crystal's internal lines. John held the finished weapon in both hands. It looked nothing like an earth gun. It was too small for the projectile size, too thin, too organic in its lines. The wood was dark and dense, polished smooth by the binding magic, and the anchor weaves traced faint silver patterns along its surface. The metal barrel was visible only at the muzzle, a small circle of gray that caught the torchlight and glinted. It was ugly. It was his. He loaded one of the refined bullets into the front of the barrel, pushing it gently with a wooden rod until it seated itself. The fit was snug, but not tight. The bullet needed to move freely when the magicules pushed it, but any gap would allow the projectile to tumble and reduce velocity. He had measured carefully. He had calculated the tolerances. He hoped he had calculated correctly. Across the cavern, 20 meters away, he had set up a stone target, a flat, heavy slab of basalt, propped against the wall, with a concentric circles drawn with chalk to indicate the point of aim. The target was not sophisticated, but it would tell him what he needed to know. Either the bullet would hit it, or it would not. Either the gun would work, or it would fail. John raised the weapon. The wood was warm against his palm, the crystal cool through the leather housing. He aligned the sighting notch with the stone target, took a breath, and let it out slowly. His hands were steady. His heart rate was calm. He had built this thing from nothing, from raw ore and dungeon wood and a crystal that he had grown with his own hands, and his own sustained attention over 3 days of sleepless concentration. It was not beautiful. It was not elegant. But it was his, and he was about to find out if it worked. He injected the magicules, not the slow trickle he used for testing, not the careful modulation that let him measure efficiency percentages and map kinetic transfer curves. This was a pulse, sharp, focused, shaped by the same principles that had guided his earliest experiments with line patterns and kinetic acceleration. The magicules left his hand, entered the crystal's input face, and found the 10 hollow channels waiting for them. Straight lines, parallel paths, 18% efficiency, which meant that nearly a fifth of the magicule energy converted directly into kinetic force instead of bleeding away into heat and vibration and the crystal's internal fractures. The bullet left the barrel before the sound reached his ears. The thwack was sharp and flat, somewhere between a heavy crossbow and a hammer striking wood, but with none of the lingering echo that followed a crossbow's string. The sound came and went in the same instant, swallowed by the cavern's stone walls. What remained was the crack of the bullet meeting the basalt target. John did not see the impact. It was too fast. What he saw was the aftermath. The flat slab of basalt exploding outward, not cracking along neat lines or splitting into a few large pieces, but fragmenting into a cloud of sharp-edged shards that sprayed across the 20 meters between target and workshop. The largest piece, still the size of his palm, carried far enough to strike the wooden wall beside his bed, embedding itself with a solid thunk that vibrated through the frame. Smaller fragments rattled against stone, skittered across the floor, and settled into silence. The cavern was quiet again. The torchlight flickered, recovering from the disturbance of air. The luminescent moss glowed steadily, indifferent to what had just occurred. John lowered the weapon. For a long moment he did not move. His arms remained extended, the gun still pointed toward the shattered target, his breathing slow and even. The smell of ozone and heated metal hung in the air, the residue of magicules moving faster than they had any right to move, of kinetic force that had crossed the space between his hand and the wall in a fraction of a second. He walked to the target. Each step felt deliberate, separate from the thoughts that were already forming behind his eyes. The stone was unrecognizable. What had been a flat slab of basalt, heavy enough to require both hands to carry, was now a scatter of fragments across a 3-meter arc. The largest piece still lay against the wall where it had embedded itself, its edges sharp and white, where the impact had sheared through the rock's natural grain. Behind it, the cavern wall bore a fresh scar, a shallow crater, perhaps a finger's width deep and twice as wide, where the bullet had transferred its remaining energy after pulverizing the target. He crouched and examined the crater. The rock was solid dungeon basalt, the same material that had stood for millennia beneath the weight of the mountain. There was no magic in it, no special property that made it softer or harder than it should be. It was just stone. And a single bullet, driven by a crystal no larger than his thumb, had carved a wound into it as if the stone were wet clay. John straightened. His mind had already begun the calculations without waiting for permission. Muzzle velocity, based on the distance to the target and the sound delay, somewhere above 300 meters per second, faster than any crossbow, faster than the black powder weapons he had read about in Earth's history books, though still slower than the rifles Earth had produced for modern militaries. Kinetic energy transfer, enough to not only penetrate the target but to destroy it, to overcome the structural cohesion of solid basalt and turn it to gravel. Material limitations. The metal bullet had not survived. He found a few tiny fragments scattered among the stone debris, thin curls of metal no larger than his fingernail, the rest vaporized or reduced to dust by the forces of acceleration and impact. He walked back to the workbench and set the gun down carefully, its barrel pointing toward the wall. He checked the crystal first, holding it up to the light. No visible degradation. The hollow channels were still there, still parallel, still lined with the faint residue of magicule flow. The internal fractures had not grown. The lattice was intact. 3 days of growth, 18% efficiency, and it had survived its first firing without complaint. The anchor weave on the barrel was another matter. He ran his fingers along the wood, feeling for heat, for stress, for any sign that the binding magic had been compromised. The weave was still present. He could see the faint silver lines pulsing in rhythm with his own unconscious wave. But there was a tension in it that had not been there before, a tightness that spoke of forces that had pushed against the wood and metal and leather and found them barely sufficient. The barrel had held. The housing had held. But the weave had been stressed near its limit. He made a note of it, filed it away for future iterations. Stronger anchor patterns. More layers, perhaps a different configuration that distributed the recoil force across a larger surface area. The bullet was gone. He found a few more fragments scattered across the floor, tiny pieces of metal that had peeled away during the barrel's acceleration, but the projectile itself had ceased to exist as a discrete object. He would need to retrieve his bullets after each shot if he wanted to reuse them. A limitation. Perhaps he could design a catch mechanism, something that would stop the bullet without destroying it. Or perhaps he would simply accept that bullets were consumables like the magicules that powered them, and learn to cast more. He sat down at the workbench, the gun before him, the notebook open to a blank page. The torchlight cast long shadows across the scattered fragments of the target, across the crater in the wall, across the small mountain of failed crystals that had led to this moment. John did not write. He did not reach for the stylus. He sat in the darkness and the flickering light and let his thoughts settle into something heavier than calculations. This changes things. The words were not dramatic. They were not accompanied by any grand revelation or sudden shift in perspective. They were simply there, a fact that he could no longer ignore. The gun was a tool. He had built it to hunt more efficiently, to protect himself from the deeper dangers of the dungeon, to test the limits of what his crystals could do. Those were the reasons he had told himself during the optimization weeks, during the mining and casting and carving. Practical reasons, engineering reasons. But the gun was also something else. It was a weapon that could kill from 20 meters with no warning, no visible magic, no spell light to give it away. It was a weapon that could be carried in one hand, that required no training in pattern weaving to use, that could be fired by anyone who could point it in the right direction and inject magicules into the crystal. And the crystal was growing more efficient with each iteration, more reliable, more powerful. He thought about the city above, about the people who traded in shadows and the guild officials with flexible ethics, and the adventurers who would kill for a weapon that gave them an edge in the deep. He thought about what would happen if the wrong person learned what he had built. He thought about what would happen if the right person learned and decided that the world needed to have this knowledge whether it was ready or not. John Doe had crossed over from Earth 3 years ago. He had seen what happened when powerful technology was released without the social infrastructure to absorb it. He had read the history of gunpowder in Europe, of nuclear fission, of the internal combustion engine, and what it had done to the atmosphere and the geopolitical landscape. A discovery was never just a discovery. It was a lever, and someone would always want to move the world with it. He picked up the gun. He turned it over in his hands, feeling the weight of it, the smoothness of the wood, the solid click of the crystal seated in its housing. It was ugly. It was his. It was a thing that should not exist, built by a man who was supposed to be dead, in a place where no one would think to look for him. He set it back on the table. For a long time, he sat in the silence, listening to the dungeon breathe, watching the anchor lines pulse faintly along the barrel's length. He did not sleep. He did not reach for his notebook. He simply sat, his hands folded on the table, his eyes fixed on the weapon he had built, and let the weight of what he had done settle into his bones. The gun was a tool. Tools could be used for many things. He was not sure what he would use this one for yet. The torch burned low. The luminescent moss glowed softly against the far wall. The crater in the stone waited in darkness, a small wound that would remain long after he had left this place. John Doe sat in his workshop, 17 years old, 3 years lost, and watched the weapon he had built grow dim in the failing light.